All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, friends, we are getting right down to it, aren't we? Election Day is 1 week from tomorrow, and we're about to get a glimpse of whatever the next phase of American life is going to be. With just a few days left for me to radar here, I wanted to lay out my realistic best and worst case scenarios for what will happen if Joe Biden is elected, and best and worst case scenarios for what will happen if Donald Trump is reelected. These are not meant to be full of wishful thinking or catastrophizing, but rather what I see as the most realistic best we can hope for and worst we should be prepared for under a first term of Biden-Harris or second term of Trump-Pence. So in terms of an order of operations here, I'm going to start today with the worst case scenario for Biden and then do Trump's worst case scenario. Then I'll move on to the best case scenarios for both. Frankly, if you watch the show, the worst case scenarios are probably pretty familiar to you already. Why? Well, because depressingly, I believe they're more likely to occur. The realistic worst case scenarios will play out if these politicians simply follow the track that they've already laid down over their careers and over their lives. Trump, if he continues his chaotic theater of incompetence, and Biden, if he persists with his almost 5-decade-long pattern of corporatism, political cowardice, and neoliberalism. For the best case scenarios I envision to play out, these men would have to surprise us, which is not something that men in their late 70s usually have a habit of doing. Old dogs, new tricks, etc., etc. But look, if there was ever a time when people are radically questioning their assumptions and rethinking their approach to the world, it is certainly right now. One thing I will say, which is somewhat obvious, is that we should recognize this election for what it is. Whoever the voters choose, we are in for a period of struggle and strife. What will the flavor and contours of that struggle look like, feel like, smell like? Well, that's what I hope to explore this week. So, let's start with our friend, former Democratic Vice President Joe Biden. In 47 years in office, the man has never developed a serious ideology or a real governing set of principles. He didn't march or get arrested in the 60s and seems to have as much antipathy towards radical activism today as he did as a young man. Joe is basically an amalgamation of slogans, cliches, and anecdotes about himself and various idealized working-class Scranton types. His career has embodied the worst of the Democratic lurch to neoliberalism. Elected to the Senate in 1972, he came of age during the Nixon years and the Reagan years, and he embraced the law and order excesses, the deficit hawk excesses, and is intoxicated with that sweet ambrosia of civility for civility's sake. In Biden's world, it's fine to partner with the credit card companies to screw over the working class, so long as you're friendly about it. He's studiously found the center in all instances, with the only memorable instance of bucking the Democratic Party's deadly consensus coming when he got ever so slightly ahead of President Obama on marriage equality. Now, the worst case scenario for a Biden administration is spelled out clearly in phrases from the candidate like, "Nothing will fundamentally change," or his pledge to Wall Street bankers not to change the laws governing their rapacious behavior, or in allegedly progressive advisor Ted Kaufman's explanation of the Wall Street Journal that they would not be able to do much when they come into office because the pantry will be bare. Now, there's plenty of evidence available that he will, in fact, just follow the well-beaten track of a corporatist presidency. The names being floated for his administration could easily have been in an Obama cabinet or a Hillary cabinet or a Bill cabinet even. Apparently, we're supposed to be happy if Ron Klain, the venture capitalist, ends up as chief of staff instead of Steve Ricchetti, the pharma lobbyist. The worst case scenario for Biden is for Joe to try relentlessly from the jump to compromise with Republicans just like he and Obama did for 8 straight years. Every bill will be a fruitless negotiation with their own side in an effort to win Republican votes, which will never come. Democrats will likely have the Senate, the House, and of course the presidency, but still find some way to claim impotence, and then it's just too hard to get anything done. Republicans have already signaled their shift back to wholesale deficit hawk rhetoric. For more than 4 decades, Joe Biden has, of course, embraced that rhetoric himself.
When I argued that we should freeze federal spending, I meant Social Security as well. I meant Medicare and Medicaid. I meant veterans benefits. I meant every single solitary thing in the government. And I not only tried it once, I tried it twice, I tried it a 3rd time, and I tried it a 4th time.
So, as Joe Biden begins his presidency with massive economic scarring from COVID, rather than grasping the moment with a wage-lifting, job-creating, and ultimately power-shifting agenda, he'll instead do virtually nothing. Keep the filibuster in place, spend precious weeks negotiating with Republicans who have no interest in coming to a deal, and then limply protesting about the unfairness of it all when it comes to naught. Every domestic economic priority, from the public option to the $15 minimum wage that does represent a tangible step forward, would crash into the rocks of this very same approach. And that'll be the best part of his presidency. Next will come an attempt to juice falling approval ratings by working with Republicans to cut spending, furthering the deep economic pain. He will, however, put in place a federal mask mandate, remove Confederate monuments from Statuary Hall, and re-enter us into the Paris Climate Accords. Joe's administration will be stocked with an historically diverse set of lobbyists, corporate executives, and Wall Street-friendly technocrats. On foreign policy, you'll basically get the opposite of whatever Trump did. That means no deal with the Taliban to get out of Afghanistan, no talks with North Korea, and no trade war with China. On the positive, there might be a chance to get back into the Iran nuclear deal. Biden is weirdly Trump-esque, actually, on foreign policy, by which I mean he has zero underlying philosophy. It's all just reactive and relationship-based. If Obama did one thing, Trump wanted to do the opposite. So it will be with Biden and Trump, plus friendly relations with whoever he happens to be chummy with and who flatters his ego effectively on the global stage. Structurally, none of the problems that gave us Trump will be solved. In fact, they'll only worsen thanks to the pandemic and the continued bifurcating of our economy into the supposedly special flowers and everyone else. I don't have to tell you that this is in no way a sustainable situation, and yet the path to a communitarian rather than xenophobic response will be blocked by a neoliberal Democratic Party bent on maintaining their own power. In my interview with him last week, Senator Bernie Sanders explained quite well what would likely happen next.
Some of my friends in the Democratic establishment are not aware, or I think cannot comprehend what some of us have in mind in terms of what will happen after Biden is elected, hopefully after he's elected. And that is, we are not going back to business as usual. There's too much pain out there. There's too much inequality out there. There's too much injustice out there. And here is what I believe from the bottom of my heart. If the Democrats, with the Democratic president, Democratic House, and Democratic Senate, cannot begin to address the real crises facing this country, then the future of this nation will be very, very dismal indeed. The people are giving us an opportunity now, and if we blow it by not being bold and aggressive, the next Trump who comes along will be even worse than this one.
Well said, sir. A continuation of neoliberalism will end in disaster. And unfortunately, that is exactly the program Joe Biden has on offer. And Sagar, I think people who watch the show regularly will be fairly familiar with the contours and outlines of that administration. Why? Because number one, Joe Biden is up in the polls, so he's very likely, more likely to be the next president. And number two, look, this just represents, if he continues to govern the way that he has, this is basically what it will look like. He would have to surprise for it to go better than this. So frankly, I think this scenario that I've outlined here today is the most likely future that we are likely to get.
I couldn't agree with you more. It's hilarious. I was just reading my friend Joe Weisenthal's newsletter this morning, and they have a Wall Street analyst who's like, what we're undercounting is what a Joe Biden landslide might mean, because he's like, then the Democrats are going to pass all of this bold progressive legislation. And I was like, well, okay, let's actually think about this. You have Biden at the helm.
Right.
At the same time, so if, let's say the Democrats do have like 54 Democratic Senate seats. That means that a Democrat won in a state like Kansas or like Doug Jones, which means that Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin would be to the left of whomever these Democratic people are. And it means that a bunch of like upper middle class suburban people are the ones who floated into the Dem camp to give them some massive style victory. You think Joe Biden is going to betray those actually fiscally conservative voters?
No.
If he were to, so like in counterintuitively, if there's a Joe Biden landslide, it actually means I think he would govern more like a conservative Republican than anywhere else, because those are the people who he's ultimately bringing into the camp.
Those are the people, I mean, just look at his campaign.
Yes.
Look at who spoke at the DNC. Look at who he's touting and vetting for potential cabinet positions. It's many more Republicans.
Jeff Flake, right?
And conservative. Like, you know, a lot of political conversation now gets defined by like who's with Trump and who's against Trump. But ideologically, like Kasich and Flake are very extreme in terms of their economic philosophy. They're very conservative, very libertarian in terms of their economic philosophy. And the Biden people spend way more time caring about what those individuals think the country should be doing, or the Never Trumpers, the Lincoln Project type, the people who are all over MSNBC all the time now. They spend a lot more time worried about that coalition than they ever spend worrying about progressives. In fact, as I've made the case before, they actually like it when progressives complain because they get to signal to the Kasich types of like, look, we're not like them, we're so moderate, you can trust us, etc. There's no reason to believe that an administration would be any different. And you make a great point about like which senators are going to be the ones that get courted and catered to. Okay, so even if, and your scenario envisions that he gets rid of the filibuster, which is not at all clear.
Not
because we all know how Democrats love to have an excuse to not actually do something. But let's say he does get rid of the filibuster. Then you are likely having to rely on people like Kristen Sinema and Joe Manchin, and maybe, if John Ossoff pulls it off down in Georgia or something like that. Like, those are the people that are you going to get Joe Manchin on board with a $15 minimum wage? Probably not.
No.
Are you going to get him on board with a public option? Maybe, probably not. So that is the landscape that you're facing in kind of like, in a scenario that is even a little better than what I envisioned. Even if he decides to get rid of the filibuster, that's what you're looking at.
No, I think you're right. And I think people really need to internalize what you laid out, which is the lack of philosophy to the extent that there is one. And then when you do, what happens? When you have no philosophy, DC colors in the lines for you because there's a whole infrastructure that's ready. They're just like, oh, sir, don't worry about it. You don't need it. We got the whole staff. They're ready. Smack in, ready to run the State Department. They've been in and out of that building for the last 30 years. Same with the Pentagon. Same with the Commerce Department, Treasury, even in the White House. That's basically what you're getting under Joe Biden.
Yeah, no, he picked the vice presidential candidate even that like Wall Street and the donor community wanted.
Exactly.
So tells you a lot.
There you go.
Next on Rising, Pennsylvania State Representative Elizabeth Fiedler is going to discuss Joe Biden's messaging on fossil fuels and whether Pennsylvania voters are buying it. That's when Rising returns.